This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Want to eat inside a restaurant? Don't forget your vaccine certificate. Proof of vaccination day has arrived in this province, and Ontarians have questions. How long will the controversial program be here for? If you haven't located it yet, how do you find your certificate? Do police and bylaw officers have the resources to enforce the new rules? Answers were in short supply when Premier Doug Ford stepped up to the mic today.
As we begin this vaccine certificate, there'll be a period of learning. I want to be clear, enforcement will lead with education.
Vaccine passports or certificates launched in Ontario last week, a development welcomed by some and strongly opposed by others. The launch raises a myriad of legal, ethical, privacy, and policy issues as jurisdictions around the world grapple with the continued global pandemic and the unusual requirements of demonstrating vaccination in order to enter some public or private spaces. Professor Colleen Flood, a colleague at the University of Ottawa, has been writing and thinking about these issues for many months. This week, she'll be part of a panel discussion that explores the policy challenges that's being hosted by the University of Ottawa's Centre for Health Law, Policy and Ethics and the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. She joins me on the podcast with an advanced preview as we discuss the legal balancing act of vaccine passports or certificates, models from around the world, and the concerns that government should be thinking about in this next stage of dealing with COVID-19. Colleen, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you're able to come on. You know, this podcast is going to drop on Monday morning, September 27th. And later that day, the University of Ottawa Centre for Health Law, Policy and Ethics, as well as the Centre for Law, Technology and Society, a couple of centers near and dear to both of our hearts, will host a panel discussion on the legal, ethical, and privacy aspects of vaccine passports and certificates. I'd encourage everyone to tune in to what promises to be a great discussion, and you can catch it online afterward if you missed the live stream. I thought I'd start our discussion with the title of the program, though, which cites both vaccine passports and certificates, sort of a slash, vaccine passport certificates. Can you unpack the language a little bit for me? You know, what are we discussing? Why the differences, and does it matter?
Yeah, I think when we were first discussing this, the way that the language was employed was using vaccine passports. And we started analyzing this back before January, kind of seeing that it was likely that we would need some kind of mechanism to record or to acknowledge the status of one's vaccination. And the language at that time was vaccine passports. But as we started to try to discuss this with policymakers and others, that language in and of itself seemed to set people off. There's something about a passport, perhaps it's ubiquitous and all-encompassing. Basically, people didn't like that word. So we started, to try to explain it's really just like a vaccine certificate, like, you have for your kids, the old yellow cards, recording the fact that one has been vaccinated and at what time. So that's why we sort of said vaccine passports, vaccine certificates. They're sort of the same thing in our mind.
Yeah. Do you expect the policymakers are going to make that kind of shift given some of the public response and the connotations that people have with respect to using the word passport?
Yeah, I think so. And also the idea of a mandate. There's also a negative reaction against mandates and in some quarters. And so you see, for example, in Alberta, the idea there is not so much as a mandate. It just means that you don't have to comply with other restrictions as a business if you use a vaccine. Require proof of vaccination at the door. So I think you see them sort of trying to use different terminologies. Even Vax Pass seems to somehow be, it's just an abbreviation, somehow seems to be a little bit more acceptable than vaccine passport. But the reality is, globally, if you're trying to travel these days, you do need proof of vaccination to avoid a lot of other restrictions that might be imposed on you. It is often coupled with the use of your actual passport if you're traveling internationally.
Right. So there really is those two dimensions, both the international travel side and now some of the domestic considerations. We'll turn to the domestic stuff in just a moment, but you mentioned that you were focusing on this many, many months ago, and I think a lot of the talk really was on the international aspects associated with this, a desire to create a system that would more readily allow for cross-border travel. How has that unfolded in your mind? What are some of the challenges that have emerged?
We were actually considering it in both aspects because we thought that it was possible that by now we would be at a point in the pandemic where we may need to employ it domestically. So we were counselling governments to try to prepare for that. Hopefully they wouldn't have to use it if all of them went as well as we hoped, but that, you can't just pull it out of your back pocket and do it in a safe, privacy respecting, human rights respecting kind of a way if you're doing it last minute. So we were talking about it domestically back then, but internationally, part of the problem has just been a resistance to the idea and an unwillingness to consider that it may be a useful tool. And then if you think about that, then how to design it the best way. So the World Health Organization, for example, has, resisted really the idea of border control and the use of things like vaccine passports, an emphasis on the idea that we really have to get everybody vaccinated first before we even have these kinds of discussions. And I think all of that has made it a little bit more difficult to have it's made it more difficult to have a concerted, sensible, global policy where we're sort of coordinated about what the requirements are. But internationally, part of the big difficulties are acknowledging which kinds of vaccines are good enough, what the kind of proof that you have to provide. So problems with fraudulent provision of sort of paper vaccinations or creating rubbishy ones at the back of someone's printer. And using that for global travel. So, but then other people who, I've just been away in New Zealand on sabbatical, coming back to Canada, will domestically here, my problem will be getting recognition of my vaccination status from New Zealand here now that I'm back.
Right. No, that you do hear about these kinds of issues, some of the forgery, some of them that I've seen circulated around quite bad. Is there anyone that's done this well, or is it just this kind of grab bag of different approaches from country to country that creates some real challenges for anyone who's looking to travel internationally, as you've got to kind of figure out precisely what the rules you have to meet?
Absolutely. So it is a grab bag of things, and it's not just your vaccination status. It's also, where and when sometimes you've been tested, are there other quarantine requirements, and so forth and so on. So, you really are, often doing a kind of a bit of a moonshot to go anywhere internationally. And then, of course, the changing circumstances of the pandemic mean that sometimes those requirements change while you're away, and as you're trying to get back, you might find things, you might find it difficult. So depending on how a particular jurisdiction is responding to COVID-19, whether they're closing borders and so forth and so on. So it isn't just a problem of vaccination passports, it's a problem more generally of the myriad kind of restrictions that are being imposed on folks as they're trying to travel around.
Yeah. Now, speaking of restrictions, not everybody, of course, has to travel internationally, but certainly people domestically have a need to go to all sorts of different places. And we, of course, have started to see in many provinces, including in Ontario, some rules with entry to some public places and some private places contingent on either proof of vaccination or at times a negative COVID test. Can you walk through a little bit some of the balancing act from an ethics perspective, let's say, that we're facing between, of course, the public health concerns on the one hand and the freedoms that most people expect they have to be able to go into public places without the need to provide that kind of information?
Yeah, sure. So, the claim is from some that requirements for proof of vaccination is impacting one's civil liberties and human rights. And so, the claim would be under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 6, mobility rights, Section 2, religious and conscience rights, and Section 7, liberty and security rights, perhaps Section 15, Section 8 when it comes to privacy. So various kinds of claims are sometimes raised that folks' rights are being infringed. I don't think that mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about rights to access things like bars and casinos, strip clubs for some reason I've specifically mentioned, but these kinds of venues, the first question is, does this rise to the level of a prima facie charter right? Is it a right to go to a bar or a restaurant? And I don't think myself, looking at the charter jurisprudence, that there necessarily is even a claim that it triggers some kind of prima facie charter right. But then, of course, as you well know, rights under the charter aren't absolute, and a government may defend an infringement of a right. So, for example, a mobility claim on the grounds that, in the context of the pandemic and the need to protect others and the need to protect the healthcare system, that it is reasonable and proportionate for the government to do what it's doing. And in the context right now where we are with the pandemic, we're dealing with a very virulent variant, with a Delta variant. It's highly transmissible. And the other fact that a court would have to consider, but for any claim, is that the vaccines themselves are not working as well against the Delta variant to stop transmission as we had seen earlier in the pandemic. And so the estimates on how effective the vaccines are at stopping transmission vary some, but, would sort of say perhaps somewhere around the 60 to 70% reduction in transmission as opposed to the 90%. And that rather ironically means that because the vaccines aren't working as well against the Delta variant, that we actually need more people to be vaccinated to protect those who can't be vaccinated. So right now, all the kids under 12, all the people who, for medical reasons can't be vaccinated, and the very, very vulnerable, for whom, even although they're protected because they're vaccinated, if the virus breaks through, so they still become infected, they might still become quite sick because they are so vulnerable. So it's this sort of paradox, you hear the anti-vaxxers claiming, well, the vaccines don't work very well, so, you shouldn't be requiring everyone to be vaccinated. But it's actually the opposite. If the vaccines worked 100% well, we probably wouldn't need to try to get, closer to between 90 and 100% of the population vaccinated. We could probably live with about 70%. So it's the kind of context of where we are in the pandemic, and it's the risk both to the unvaccinated themselves, but to others around in society right now, that we need to try to spur higher rates of vaccination. And if we can do that, by saying, look, if you're prepared to roll up your sleeve, then you can go to the pub. I suspect a court would find that both reasonable and proportionate in the circumstances right now, And I think the really important thing to realize is that this analysis that I'm giving you here is contextual to the pandemic right now. It's where we're at right now. So, I know some folks are really worried about the slippery slope of vaccine passports and it's embedding some sort of awful government thing. But the justification for it will wane. We won't need them necessarily. In hopefully a few months. Hopefully we won't need them. We'll have done the trick. So I think over time, we have to reevaluate: are the justifications still sufficient for us to require vaccine passports? And I think with a pinch of luck, they will disappear.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of shifting analysis or shifting circumstances, I suppose, of course, has been a hallmark, I think, of what we've all experienced for the last year and a half. Do you think that government and policymakers, as they put this into place, are sufficiently adept at kind of navigating those changes? I can certainly hear people saying we get that right now there's this need for this, but just government hasn't proven itself, some would say, ability to pivot fast enough. And once we put this into place, the notion that somehow they'll just make a shift in a few months because circumstances have changed, may strike some as unlikely.
Well, I guess that's a fair point, that government is not always what we aspire it to be or hope it to be. I think, the conservative governments that have reluctantly now brought in vaccination passports or vaccination certificate requirements in Ontario and Alberta have made it pretty abundantly clear they really don't want to be doing this. So I suspect, to appeal politically to their base and so forth, they'll be wanting to get rid of it. So the politics might line up in the large provinces to move away from that in any regard. But we always do have the ability to challenge this under the Charter as we go along. And so you may be right. Perhaps some governments might see some advantage to requiring proof of vaccination, although I find it hard to see what that would be really, given the cost for businesses and I think most of us don't really want to have to do this, even if we support it as a measure to fight the pandemic, the political cost of this. So I really do think it will have a natural expiry date, politically and otherwise. But if not, then one could bring a successful charter challenge, most likely to say, you don't need to have this anymore. So why do you have it?
Yeah. One of the issues that comes to mind, in addition to the many charter issues that you have identified, and I guess it wraps up in the charter as well, of course, is privacy-related issues. And it sort of immediately comes to mind, both with respect to the way that one implements the system and uses different kinds of technology to try to do that, as well as the need to provide that kind of information. How do we address some of those privacy issues? Have privacy commissioners or others in that community spoken out about how you navigate some of those concerns?
I'm not sure what the privacy commissioners are saying, but I agree that concerns about privacy are important, and that they need to be the Vax Pass regime or system needs to be designed with best privacy principles in mind. The way that my colleague and your colleague, Vivek and Vivek has described it, is that with a good design, it should be basically like your license plate on your car. So you see the license plate on your car, it's flash, one time really at the server as you're crossing the threshold of wherever, and that then is all that's needed. They don't need to take any more information. It's just to validate the fact that you've had a vaccination that is current, and boom, you're in. So I am not an expert in privacy law as you are, Michael and Vivek, but I think that from all accounts that I hear is that it can be done well. It can be done in a privacy protective kind of a mode, and similar to flashing your license plate. Now, of course, can always be bad actors. And folks who will, perhaps want to take that information, I guess going into a restaurant or a bar. But again, as you know better than I, they already have so many other means to extract your personal health information as you're coming in other kinds of ways. Would seem surprising if they'd need this as well. But, I know at least in the Ontario regulations, there are penalties for those who might try to take more information than is required. So it says, none of this information is kept. So I think too that it's important to note that there would be, one of the arguments that we made was that it would be important, we thought, for governments to actually roll out these systems, because they then should, be under the sunlight of charter scrutiny. They should be under the sunlight of scrutiny from a privacy perspective. And that overall would be a better thing to happen than for individual businesses on their own steam to implement, requirements for citing vaccination passports and so on. So we thought that might be kind of a Wild West if that was to happen. But so we thought it would be better actually if governments did this because of all the legal checks that would then ensue.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I recall reading that was one of the concerns you highlighted, that if the governments fail to act, the private sector would. Have we seen some of those kind of initiatives that might now be, I guess, surpassed by some of the provincial initiatives that we're starting to see?
You have, and I have to say that the ones that were moving first in the end, perhaps that was actually a good thing. We were kind of imagining perhaps more, unfortunate examples of implementing vax checks without, all the bells and whistles. But, I think you want to have a regime where it is clear what the responsibilities are regarding privacy, for example, that no other data is needed to be provided to the venue apart from flashing the fact that you've got the QR code, or either on your paper, on your piece of paper, or on your phone, however you want to do it. And that's all that's needed, right? No other information needs to be collected. And as I said, I think it's better if the government does this as opposed to individual private providers. But I guess people have very different views on this. A lot of folks seem to think it's much worse if government does it as opposed to the private sector. But I don't really get that.
Yeah, we certainly have seen a fair number of private sector initiatives, especially on the technical side. I know that, it's almost as soon as the Ontario government launched its initiative, people were identifying easier ways to insert this into your Apple wallet and things like that, sort of essentially saying we're not going to wait for the government to move. It's unfortunate, given that people have known this is coming for so long, that the government wasn't able to roll something out at the same time. In some ways there echoes a little bit of some of the debates over the contact tracing apps that we had earlier in the pandemic, and the value of using technology and the role that government plays in that.
Yeah, for sure. I think with this though, not everybody will want to have it digitally for all sorts of reasons. One, two can, and providing that you have a paper with your QR code, or I can't see why that would be problematic either. So it's just really a requirement of proof of vaccination. The digitalization makes it more convenient and probably helps safeguard against some of the fraud, perhaps, although I think there can be debates about that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The sort of the paper-based version. I teach an annual course with the University of Haifa in Israel and Bocconi University in Italy, and we focused back in May on a whole series of sort of COVID meets technology issues. And one of the first issues that we focused on were vaccine passports and certificates. And you may recall, of course, that Israel was certainly far ahead of Canada at that time. Most of the Canadians were bemoaning the lack of access to vaccines, whereas in Israel, the focal point was on the issue that we're talking about. Exactly. And many of the students said that while there was an electronic version, they simply relied on a paper-based version for entry into malls or into the university or the range of places where that system was in place. It brings to mind this question of kind of models that we can be following as we start seeing this rolled out in provinces across the country. Is there anyone in your mind that has been doing this particularly well? Because we're obviously not the first to start trying to move in this direction.
Well, I think a lot of what we will follow to some extent is, what has happened in Israel for sure with the Green Pass. But, when we talk about how to do it well, we have to talk about it in the context of the Canadian circumstance. So Canadian laws, Canadian privacy requirements, Canadian human rights regimes, and all that sort of thing. And then in the context of where we are in the pandemic. So all of those things together, I think, have to go into, what is the best sort of system for us right now. So I think we can take inspiration from things like the Green Pass in Israel. One of the things that folks who have legitimate, I think, as opposed to spurious worries about the vaccination passport bring up is the worry about enforcement. And so discriminatory enforcement against, folks from racial groups or visible minorities or the homeless and so on. So I think this is an issue that we really have to keep a close eye on. I think it would be difficult to really sort of probably detect problems with this, but there may be that you have examples of servers or owners of businesses, perhaps scrutinizing more deeply people's vaccine passports from if they have certain characteristics. And we have this problem more generally about how we enforce laws and policy requirements. So I think this has to be attended to, and that's a big issue for us. And I'm honestly not sure what we do about that. But I also know on the other side of the ledger that if COVID wreaks havoc, which it can do with the Delta, as we're seeing in Alberta, and in other places that haven't controlled it well, its victims are mainly those from more marginalized communities. And so you've got both sides of the ledger here. There is this possible risk, I guess, of unfair enforcement and discrimination against some folks. But on the other hand, it's those same people and their communities that will be most at risk if COVID takes off again. And of course, not only from the disease itself, but from the other measures that would have to put into place, like lockdowns and that sort of thing. So, the collateral damage of the precautions that we have to take against COVID-19 are also more heavily borne by these more vulnerable communities, marginalized communities. So that's a tough one. But I think going along with vaccine passports, best practices also suggest that at the same time, we need to be getting vaccines to the people in the easiest way possible. So all those folks that haven't got vaccinated, that are willing to get vaccinated now, this shouldn't be like the Hunger Games as it was in Ontario when we were first getting the vaccines into the arms of everyone. It's got to be a hell of a lot easier than that. And so, someone working a couple of jobs with a couple of kids and no one to look after them, that that you can easily walk out the door and get your vaccine without having to move heaven and heck to get there. So, I think those are two things that have to be attended to for the best kind of system, and the privacy. Making sure that we have good privacy protections as well, so that people aren't worried about this data being used in any other kind of way to adversely harm them in any kind of way.
Yeah. So it sounds like that where you're landing is that there are challenges, to be sure, both in terms of ensuring that there is that access to the vaccines, that there are the necessary safeguards, both from a timeliness perspective, assessing whether or not this remains necessary, as well as the kinds of precautions you've been talking about, say on the privacy side, in terms of how this gets implemented, but all of this in a context of quite obviously a global pandemic in which the public health care benefits outweigh some of those risks, so long as we are attuned to some of those risks and challenges along the way.
Absolutely. It certainly isn't anything I know that people like, why would we want to do this? There really is no grand conspiracy here. As you sort of hear about a fair bit. First of all, no one could get that organized, I think, to have such a grand conspiracy. But secondly, I'm sure neither you nor I really have any desire to have to show a vaccine passport when we go to a restaurant. This is not anything that anyone wants to do. But for the purposes of protecting the unvaccinated, the kids under 12, the vulnerable, and just trying to bring this thing to its knees for a time-limited period, this is the right thing to do. I should also add that I think a really good feature of any vaccine passport would, just to hark back to our earlier point, would be to sort of have a sunset clause on them, and so that we would, review it in a few months to see, is this absolutely necessary anymore? Or can we achieve our goal through lesser means now?
It's just some interesting proposals about how we can address some of those issues, and I'm sure more of those will come up as part of the discussion panel that will take place on Monday. Colleen, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Michael.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.